You're trying to work, your laptop is open, your coffee is getting cold, and somewhere in the last 4 minutes, your cat decided the most important surface in the room is your keyboard. You nudge it away. It comes back. You nudge it again. It stares at you like you're the one being unreasonable. And here's the strange part, you're not annoyed. You're weirdly charmed. A dog would never get away with this. A dog obeys. A cat negotiates, ignores, and somehow still ends up fed, sheltered, and adored by a species 8 times its size. So how exactly did an animal that refuses almost every command we give it become one of the most successful companions in human history? The answer isn't really about cats being trained. It's about cats never being trained at all, and that's exactly why it worked. Let's start with a fact that surprises most people. Humans never actually domesticated cats the way we domesticated almost everything else. With dogs, sheep, cows, and horses, humans selected individuals for specific traits, friendliness, obedience, usefulness, and bred them generation after generation until the species itself physically and behaviorally changed. Cats didn't get that treatment. In 2007, geneticist Carlos Driscoll led a large-scale genetic study comparing the DNA of domestic cats to wildcat populations across the globe, and the findings pointed to a single origin: the Near Eastern wildcat Felis sylvestris libica, first linked to humans roughly 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. But here's the twist. The genetic differences between that wild ancestor and your cat curled up on the couch right now are remarkably small compared to the differences between wolves and modern dogs. In other words, dogs were shaped by us deliberately over thousands of generations. Cats mostly showed up as they already were, and we just never got around to changing them. So if humans weren't actively breeding cats for friendliness, how did this relationship even start? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating. The leading theory, often called self-domestication, suggests cats essentially domesticated themselves. Around 10,000 years ago, as humans in the Fertile Crescent transitioned into agriculture, they began storing surplus grain, and grain storage attracts rodents, and rodents attract wildcats. The wildcats that were bold enough to hang around human settlements, but calm enough not to flee at the sight of people, got a reliable food source without lifting a claw for us. Over generations, natural selection quietly favored the cats who tolerated humans best, not because we chose them, but because tolerating us was evolutionarily a very good career move. We didn't tame the cat. The cat clocked in for pest control and simply never left. But wait, if this was just a convenient rodent control arrangement, why does it feel like something so much deeper than that today? Here's where the archaeological evidence gets almost eerie. In 2004, archaeologists excavating a Neolithic grave on the island of Cyprus uncovered something remarkable. A human skeleton buried roughly 9,500 years ago, deliberately positioned alongside the skeleton of a cat, both oriented the same direction, both apparently placed with intention. Cyprus has no native wildcat population, which means humans had to have deliberately transported this animal by boat. Think about that for a second. Before writing existed, before the wheel was common technology, someone thought a cat was important enough to bring across open water, and important enough to be buried with a person in death. This wasn't pest control anymore. Somewhere between the granary and that grave, the relationship had already changed into something more personal. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Cats didn't just sneak into human homes. In at least one civilization, they got worshipped into them. Ancient Egypt took this further than any culture in recorded history. By around 1500 BCE, the goddess Bastet was depicted as a cat or a cat-headed woman, associated with protection, fertility, and the home. Killing a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, could carry the death penalty, and the Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Egyptian households would shave their eyebrows in mourning specifically when a household cat died naturally. Archaeologists have uncovered enormous cat cemeteries in Egypt, including one site at Bubastis containing the mummified remains of hundreds of thousands of cats, some elaborately wrapped and buried with tiny offerings of milk and mice for the afterlife. It's worth pausing on that number, hundreds of thousands. This wasn't a handful of beloved pets. This was an entire civilization organizing religious infrastructure around an animal that, biologically speaking, still had almost no interest in obeying a single human command. Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. Humans built temples for an animal that, to this day, will not reliably come when called. And somehow that felt like a fair trade. The reverence went even further than temples and cemeteries. Historical accounts describe ancient Egyptians as being so protective of cats that exporting them out of the country was, at various points, restricted or outright forbidden. There are even accounts, repeated by later Greek and Roman writers, describing Egyptian officials attempting to recover cats that had been smuggled abroad, effectively treating a domestic animal as a kind of protected national resource. Whether every detail of these secondhand accounts holds up under modern scrutiny is debated among historians, but the underlying attitude is well documented regardless. Egypt didn't just like cats, it legislated around them, culturally and religiously, in a way no civilization had done for any animal before. Now, here's something that complicates even the single domestication story, and it's the kind of detail that rarely makes it into shorter explainers. A follow-up genetic study published in 2017, led by researcher Ava Maria Geigel, and colleagues analyzing ancient cat DNA from archaeological sites across Europe, Africa, and the Near East spanning roughly 9,000 years, found evidence suggesting cats actually spread in at least two major waves. The first wave tracked the expansion of early farming communities out of the Near East. But a second, later wave of a specific coat pattern lineage spread rapidly across the Roman world and beyond, likely carried along Roman trade networks and shipping routes centuries later. What's remarkable is that this second wave doesn't appear to have been driven primarily by selective breeding either. It looks more like cats simply hitching a ride on the largest, most efficient transportation network. Humans had built up to that point, and thriving wherever it took them. Even the spread of cats across the ancient world wasn't something humans carefully orchestrated. It was something cats largely accomplished by riding along on a civilization already in motion. But not every chapter of this story is affectionate. If cats were so beloved, why does European history have such a dark stretch where they were nearly wiped out? This is the counterexample that complicates the whole narrative, and it's important not to skip past it. During parts of the medieval period in Europe, particularly from the 12th through 14th centuries, cats became entangled in superstition, folklore, and religious persecution, often associated with witchcraft and considered unlucky or even demonic, especially black cats. Historical records describe periodic culling of cat populations in various European towns, sometimes tied to religious panic and public rituals. For years, a popular theory suggested this mass killing of cats directly worsened the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century by removing natural predators of the rats that carried plague-infested fleas. More recent historical and epidemiological research has complicated that specific causal claim, noting the plague spread involved complex factors beyond rat populations alone, including human fleas and lice as possible transmission vectors. But regardless of the precise epidemiological mechanism, the broader point stands undisputed. An animal so revered it once had its own cemetery of hundreds of thousands could, centuries later, in a different culture, be feared and slaughtered instead. The relationship between humans and cats was never simple, uninterrupted gratitude. It was always a little bit unstable, always shaped by whatever humans needed to believe at the time. And it's worth noting that Europe's fear of cats during this stretch wasn't a universal human response. It was regional, and even contradicted elsewhere in the world at the exact same time. In much of the medieval Islamic world, cats were regarded with genuine warmth rather than suspicion. Historical accounts describe the Prophet Muhammad as having a notable fondness for cats, including a widely repeated tradition in which he is said to have cut off the sleeve of his garment rather than disturb a cat sleeping on it. Cats were generally considered ritually clean animals in Islamic tradition, permitted in mosques and homes alike, a sharp contrast to the suspicion surrounding dogs in some interpretations of the same period. So, at the very moment cats were being blamed for witchcraft in parts of Christian Europe, they were simultaneously being treated with tenderness a few hundred miles away, on the other side of a cultural and religious boundary. Same species, same historical moment, two wildly different verdicts. Proof that what cats symbolized was never really about the animal itself. It was always about the humans doing the symbolizing. So how did cats claw their way back from persecution into becoming one of the most popular pets on the planet? Slowly, and mostly by doing what they'd always done, surviving on their own terms. As European rat populations remained a persistent problem in cities, ships, and farms, cats remained practically valuable regardless of shifting superstition. And by the time colonial trade routes expanded across the 15th through 18th centuries, cats were deliberately carried aboard ships specifically to control rodent populations that could otherwise destroy food supplies and gnaw through wooden hulls. This is genuinely how cats spread to nearly every inhabited continent on Earth, not primarily as beloved companions during this stretch of history, but as working animals with a very specific, unglamorous job. Sailors in several maritime traditions came to view cats as good luck aboard ship, and losing a ship's cat overboard was sometimes considered a bad omen serious enough to unsettle an entire crew. The affection came back later, the usefulness never really left. But here's a question worth asking directly. If cats spent so much of history valued purely for function, pest control on a farm, pest control on a ship, when did humans start treating them as something closer to family? That shift happened surprisingly recently, at least compared to the 10,000-year timeline we've been tracing. Cats becoming primarily indoor companion animals, kept mainly for company rather than labor, is largely a 19th and 20th century phenomenon in much of the industrialized world, accelerated by growing urbanization, which reduced the practical need for working rodent control, and later by the invention of clay-based cat litter in 1947, which made keeping a cat indoors dramatically more manageable than it had ever been. It's a strange thought. An animal humans have lived alongside for roughly 10,000 years only became a primarily indoor, cuddled, thoroughly modern pet within the last 100 or so. For the overwhelming majority of the relationship's history, cats worked for a living. The lap cat is a relatively new arrangement, historically speaking, even if it feels timeless from inside your living room. But here's where the story gets scientifically strange in a completely different way. Because modern research suggests cats might be doing something far more calculated than simply tolerating us. In 2009, animal behavior researcher Karen McComb and her team at the University of Sussex published a study analyzing what they called the solicitation purr, a specific type of purring many cats use, primarily when asking for food, that embeds a higher-pitched cry within the low rumble of a normal purr. When researchers played recordings of this specific purr to human participants, listeners rated it as noticeably more urgent and less pleasant than an ordinary purr, and further analysis suggested the embedded frequency shares acoustic similarities with the frequency range of a human infant's cry. In other words, some cats appear to have evolved or learned a vocalization that quietly exploits the same neurological wiring that makes a parent unable to ignore a crying baby. Your cat may not technically be manipulating you on purpose in any conscious sense, but something in its evolutionary toolkit figured out, generation after generation, exactly which sound makes you get out of bed at 6 in the morning to fill a food bowl that's still half full. And it doesn't stop at sound. Researchers studying oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, have found that interactions between cats and their owners, including extended eye contact and gentle touch, are associated with measurable increases in oxytocin levels in humans, similar to bonding responses documented between people and dogs, though generally with more variability given how selectively cats choose to initiate that contact. That word selectively is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's really the whole point. A dog's affection often feels reliably available. A cat's affection feels earned, rationed, occasionally withdrawn without explanation, and bizarrely, that scarcity seems to make humans want it more, not less. But wait, what about the argument that cats simply don't bond with humans at all? That it's all one-sided projection from lonely apartment dwellers naming their food dispenser Mom? This is a fair challenge, and for a long time, some researchers genuinely entertained it. But a 2019 study conducted by researchers Kristen Vitale and Monique Udell at Oregon State University directly tested this using a method adapted from human-infant attachment research, exposing cats to a brief separation from their owner followed by a reunion, then analyzing behavioral responses. The results showed the majority of cats displayed clear, secure attachment behaviors upon reunion, seeking proximity to their owner while still feeling confident enough to explore the room, a pattern strikingly similar to secure attachment styles documented in human children and dogs. This wasn't cats performing indifference for social media. This was measurable, replicable evidence that many cats form genuine attachment bonds with specific humans, even while retaining an independence that makes that bond look completely different from a dog's. There's one more piece of behavioral science worth pausing on, because it might be the single most relatable finding in all of this research. In 2020, psychologist Karen McComb's colleague at the time, researcher Tasman Humphrey, along with a team at the University of Sussex, published a study specifically examining the slow blink that lazy, half-closed eye look cats give the humans they trust. Researchers found that when owners slow blinked at their own cats, the cats were significantly more likely to slow blink back and were also more likely to approach a stranger's outstretched hand after that stranger had slow blinked at them first compared to a stranger who simply stared without blinking. In other words, there's now a scientifically documented, low-effort, unmistakably charming way to say "I trust you" in a language that apparently works across species. It's not a command. It's not a trick learned for a treat. It's something closer to a shared, quiet signal that evolved between two species that otherwise communicate almost nothing else the same way. So here's a comparison worth making directly, because it's the clearest way to understand why cats won without ever really trying. Dogs were bred over thousands of years, quite deliberately, to read human faces, follow human pointing gestures, and prioritize human approval above almost everything else, a suite of traits researchers studying canine cognition have documented extensively, showing that even young puppies with no training can follow a human's pointed finger to find hidden food. a skill many other highly intelligent animals, including some primates, struggle with. Cats were never bred for that kind of responsiveness, and studies on feline cognition confirm it. Cats can recognize their owner's voice specifically, distinguishing it clearly from a stranger's, but they frequently choose not to respond to it with the same urgency a dog would. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a completely different evolutionary bargain. A dog's ancestors survived by being useful and obedient within a pack structure that included humans at the top. A cat's ancestors survived by being useful while remaining functionally solitary predators who simply tolerated close proximity to us. Two species, two completely different survival strategies, arriving in our living rooms by two completely different doors. Here's a pattern interrupt that might reframe everything you've heard so far. Obedience was never the price of entry into human affection. It just happened to be the price dogs paid. Cats found a different currency entirely, presence without submission, and it turned out humans were willing to pay handsomely for that too. But what about the biological argument that this bond simply can't be as deep from the cat's side, given how much shorter and more independent their evolutionary relationship with us has been compared to dogs, whose ancestors are generally believed to have split off from wolves many thousands of years earlier than cats split from their wild ancestors? It's true the timelines differ, and it's true the underlying wiring differs. But independence and attachment aren't actually opposites, even in humans. Plenty of securely attached relationships involve two parties who don't strictly need each other to survive, yet still choose closeness anyway. If anything, that might make the cat relationship more emotionally interesting, not less. A bond that exists purely out of necessity is one thing. A bond that keeps happening for 10,000 years, despite one party never being fully dependent on the other, is something closer to an ongoing choice, repeated across hundreds of generations, rather than an evolutionary obligation neither side can escape. And this raises a bigger question that stretches well beyond cats. Are they actually unique in this, or is this just what happens whenever a species domesticates itself instead of being domesticated by force? Researchers studying domestication broadly have pointed to a small handful of other animals that followed a similar self-selecting path rather than deliberate breeding, including some populations of urban foxes and even, controversially, elements of early human domestication of certain fish species kept in managed ponds. But cats remain probably the clearest, most widespread example of an animal that walked itself most of the way into human civilization, adapted just enough to survive comfortably alongside us, and then simply stopped changing. Dogs kept evolving under our direction for thousands of years after that initial contact. New breeds, new temperaments, entire body shapes redesigned to fit human preference, from mastiffs bred for war to lapdogs bred for nothing but companionship. Cats mostly didn't. Even today, the vast majority of domestic cats worldwide are essentially free breeding, not shaped by human-controlled pedigrees the way most dog breeds are. Purebred, human-designed cat breeds exist, but they represent a small fraction of the world's cat population compared to the overwhelming majority of random-bred cats who look, behave, and hunt remarkably similarly to that Near Eastern wildcat from 10,000 years ago. In a very real sense, most cats you'll ever meet are still walking around in their original evolutionary outfit, mildly inconvenienced that we insist on calling it a costume. Now here's something worth sitting with, because it flips the entire question the video started with. We keep asking how cats won over humans. But what if the more accurate question is what humans got out of refusing to give up on an animal that never fully needed us? There's a psychological concept researchers sometimes call intermittent reinforcement. The idea that rewards